Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Hey, remember when ride-sharing company Uber was supposedly some kind of technological revolution, and then we realized that it was a perennially unprofitable cab company? Whew, boy, that was some good shit, huh? A lot of people, both boosters and critics, got things very wrong during Uber's early days. Like, for example, some critics predicted that gig work would eat up larger and larger portions of the economy, but this prediction has not panned out. Both hype and criti-hype give you unrealistic pictures of the present and expectations of the future if you buy into them. But even as Uber and Lyft remain highly unprofitable enterprises with unclear futures, they have managed to do a fair amount of economic and social damage in the meantime. My favorite book on this topic so far is Disrupting DC: The Rise of Uber in the Fall of the City by Katie Wells, Kafui Attoh, and Declan Cullen. And the reason why I like this book is precisely because of its focus on urban governance. The authors show that many people in Washington, D.C. took on a mindset akin to let Uber do it when facing any number of social problems. And that this mindset stemmed less from any real faith that Uber would do a good job than in a profound distrust in and pessimism about city government being able to do anything productive at all. In this episode, I talked to Wells and Attoh about this new book, which drops this week. Hey, congrats to the authors. And hey, you should check out this book. I had a great time talking with Katie and Kafui. I hope you enjoy it. Hey, get excited. Katie and Kafui, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Great to be here.
So I really enjoyed, first of all, I want to say, you guys, it's a very well-written book. I read a lot of books in this trade, and I thought, oh, it's so clear, it's really nice, so good work, and cheers.
Thank you.
For that. Disrupting, it's a cool book, so Disrupting DC, when you explain it to strangers, what do you say about it, and what were you trying to do with it?
You know, when I talk to strangers about the book, I say, hey, you ever taken that thing called Uber? Yeah, well, we wrote a book about how it's changing the way cities work. It's a story, I say, look, I'm a geographer. I study urban change. How did I get wrapped up in this Uber tech thing? Well, because it's impossible to think about.
Mm-hmm. Kafui, do you want to add anything to that? Well, you guys can just riff all day long.
Obviously, people have asked me, what the book is about, and then I talk for 10 minutes, and their eyes roll back in their head. So I haven't quite got the
believe me, brother, I know the feeling.
Pitch, but I kind of say what Katie says, though less elegantly. I often say, it's about Uber and about the politics of cities and how Uber has intervened in the politics of cities. So I try to talk about it. I try to say politics, multiple times. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's right. We thought the book was going to be called Uber's Urban Politics. I mean, there is an argument to be made that it was sort of about its attempt to, get rid of the kind of politics that we were pushing for. In a moment of far right, fascist attempts, we see Uber as, something, as building something that's not sort of a democratic urban politics that we actually want.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting. I mean, you all draw on a number of different literatures, including literatures centrally focused on technology, but also there's a real rootedness in studies of urban governance is like the frame. And so I just kind of give listeners a little background about like where studies of urban governance have been for the last couple decades, and then like what you were trying to contribute to that conversation. Kafui, it looks like you've been volunteered on this one, is what I think that finger was doing.
Well, so maybe just some context, so both Katie, Declan, and I, came out of a geography program, and we consider ourselves, urban geographers, and there is a thread in kind of urban geography, but there's also it's not limited to geography. There's a whole bunch of work in political science, sociology, that is interested in kind of what cities can do, like what is politically possible in cities, and how that is shaped by broader economic changes or transformations. So, what in what ways can cities better the lives of me and you? How can we as citizens elect mayors or council people with the idea that they'll actually do something for us, and especially for the least among us in cities. And I think so in all those different disciplines, there was kind of a recognition, starting in the late 70s and through the 80s with deindustrialization, that the cities were constrained politically. Mayors were constrained politically. That the kind of I don't know how else to describe it, distributionist politics of a previous era were no longer that sort of politics was gone, and we were entering a kind of neoliberal kind of era. Hate to drop the neoliberal word, but I don't know how else to describe it. The kind of a sense that cities, in trying to better the lives of people, had a very narrow range of policy interventions, and those were, promote real estate, cut government spending at the local level, engage in public-private partnerships, rely increasingly on the private sector, try to, try to encourage real estate development, oftentimes in a speculative manner, rather than, the kind of industrial policy that, had defined the previous era. So that was the kind of literature. I can name some names of the people. There's but
no. That was good.
That's the kind of, in terms of urban governance, what can cities do for the people who politically? What can what is local public? What is local urban politics for?
And that was sort of the get-go when we started this research in 2016. One of the things at the beginning we kept playing with was the idea of what kind of urban development is this? What kind of urban development is happening when a city like DC, is getting in bed with Uber? Is this just more of the same contracting out public-private partnerships that we've seen since the 1980s, sort of referred to by David Harvey as like the entrepreneurial city? Or is there something different afoot, right? Because in the scenario we see, right, it's not really that the city is sort of hiring Uber to do its beckoning. It's almost the opposite, where Uber is calling the shots and the city is bending down and doing its work for it. And so it felt like there was, I don't know. So from the get-go, we're like, what's going on here? What is this relationship? Is it all fine and good?
Yeah, and the way you put it a couple times throughout the book is like the motto becomes something like "just let Uber do it." So if Kafui is like laying out this world of constraint, then it becomes like, well, Uber's going to step in and like provision all this stuff, right? Is that the
Yeah,
vision,
absolutely.
Katie?
And in some ways, right, we follow 40 Uber drivers, but also 30 policymakers as they contend with questions about their own limitations. And we wanted to know, like, why are you getting involved with Uber? And their feeling was that they themselves were constrained, right? And they, they want to provide paratransit services. They want to make sure that workers can get home at night. They want to make sure that unemployed and underemployed folks can earn extra income. And if Uber is a way to do it, like, why not?
You guys had this really nice couple lines I liked a lot. It was says, few with whom we spoke held up Uber as a real solution to DC's transportation, racial, economic, or employment challenges. Yet their expectations of the city and its democratic institutions were even lower. It's like, that's kind of like, is this a kind of sad statement about our faith in democracy and just institutions generally?
Yes.
These days, huh?
Right. I'm from Northeast Ohio. Like, if we don't have hope in DC, come on, right?
Well, it's interesting because I think we toyed with a different title for the book, and it was just going to be called Lowered Expectations. I don't know if there was what was it, Mad TV? There was a skit they used to do called Lowered. It was a hilarious skit, but it kind of captures that statement, that vibe.
That
exactly.
vibe. Yeah. I want to back up a little bit. How did your team come together? I mean, this is an interesting writing project involving 3 folks. So how did you come together to do this?
Well, I was going to study Airbnb because I was a housing researcher. But I was qualitatively trained. I was qualitatively trained in qualitative methods. No. I didn't figure out how to do it. And I had a babysitter take an Uber home one night. Kafui had been studying buses, which is not terribly far from Uber. And so we threw our hat in the, ring for a seed grant to study Uber. Declan at the time just moved to DC, and we said, hey, and it got started like that pretty much. I mean, we all went to grad school together, right? So we come at this with a very simple, we went to grad school in upstate New York at Syracuse University. We all overlapped and graduated within a year of each other. So I don't want to say we came of age together, but we, have a certain level of trust, understanding, resources.
Yeah. So important when you're doing work together. So, you started saying a bit about it earlier, but what kind of work what kind of research did you do for the book?
Yeah, sure. So, we did interviews. So, we tried to, it's an interesting story actually in terms of how we came to it. So our original plan was to recruit Uber drivers by using the grant money we had gotten to pay for Declan to take rides basically throughout DC. And we printed out these little cards with like a link to a Survey Monkey, and it was like a complete disaster. Like Declan took some rides, like no one wanted to talk to him. We weren't getting any bites.
Or the ones that did, right? We're like, yeah, I'll call you. Nobody called.
So there was so little uptake. What is the word? Yeah, so little. Our recruitment strategy kind of wasn't working, and so we moved online and we posted a kind of the survey to a chat room. What was it called? uberpeople.net, which and of course we had incentives for the people who spoke to us, and then they came flooding in, and then this was like, it was kind of intense because Survey Monkey allows you to track the IP address of where the people are filling it out. And so we were getting people filling out the survey in like Kuala Lumpur. And so we had to kind of narrow it down, but that became both, we collected information from them, demographic information, educational attainment information, but it also became the pool of people that we could reach out to for more extended interviews, which,
and in-person surveys. We ended up trashing all that data. I don't know if you remember.
Right.
We actually trashed all that survey data because we felt like we couldn't confirm it, but we used it as a way to meet in person those 40 first drivers.
Okay.
Which was hard.
Okay.
So, and then, well, then I think, interesting enough, like during this period when we were struggling to talk with drivers, we did set up interviews with policymakers, and some of those interviews were really fascinating, like really interesting. And so I think we had these two tracks. And I don't know if I'm remembering this right, Katie, but I think, we had these two tracks where it was like, we'll just talk to drivers and then talk to people about, Uber as a, this thing that's happening in the city at this time. This is all in 2016, right? Yeah, 2016, 17. Yeah.
But we did a longitudinal study, right? That's a setup. But what made the project fun, I think, for me, was that we went back to the same group of folks year after year after year and did the same similar interviews and surveys. So we were able to get a great sense of people's lives as they moved on and off the app, as well as policymakers, sort of own thinking as they contended with questions about, should I regulate this thing now or not?
Yeah.
Right. So set the scene for us, in 2011, 2012, when Uber first comes into DC, DC is a sixth city in the States, is that right? So what is the scene? What happens when Uber enters DC at that period?
Well, Uber starts up illegally, as it does in all of the places where it operates. And within a few months, it pissed off the local taxi regulators, rightly so. And so in response to this flagrant or vagrant? Which flagrant.
Flagrant, yeah.
Flagrant disregard for law, the local taxi regulator, Ron Linton, staged a sting, and he ordered an Uber from his smartphone, took it to a hotel in downtown DC where he had folks waiting to arrest I guess not arrest, right? Just give what was it, Kafui?
I think
Give
it was
them
like
a
16 fine and impound his car.
Impound. That's right. Impound the car and give him a $1,600 fine, which Uber supposedly paid then. But it began sort of, Travis Kalanick, the former CEO or co-founder of Uber, he showed up at DC Council, more than once, was really combative and made DC in many ways sort of out to look silly. For not bowing down more quickly, though it did in the end.
Another piece of that in that same year in 2012, I think it comes up multiple times in the book, is the kind of Operation Rolling Thunder, which is, so
no relationship to Vietnam, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Basically in that, after the Linton sting, I think it was June or July, there was an attempt by the council to impose some kind of minimum regulations on Uber, which it had just started, and it was basically to regulate how they collect fares. In part of it was setting kind of a floor. But so in response to that attempt, Uber basically reached out to all of the people who had taken the service, because it's, a service you use on your phone. So they had their phone number and email, and they, basically petitioned the people to petition their elected officials to strike down any regulation. And it, at the time, it was kind of a huge deal. I mean, the the inboxes of the elected officials were like flooded. I mean, this is like real political participation.
Yeah.
And this country is like,
democracy in action,
the
folks.
people are just like, and so you have these council people who are, probably not used to like getting so much pushback from this group of people. And
I think the figure was
50,000
in 24 hours. I think in a 24-hour period.
Yeah,
it was wild.
Yeah.
Less than 24 hours.
So it was kind of, we tell the story because we think it captures the political power that Uber. It was a flex.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was a real flex, like a real flex from the tech sector, and they knew it. So basically, it starts from there. What does this mean? How do we make sense of this?
I always wonder, I mean, like how much, because we have, we all know Uber just starts illegally. They just do this thing and, they just go for it, right? And that seems real bad. It is bad, in fact. But it also, I always wonder how much of the response to it had to do with how unsympathetic the taxi industry was in so many places. I mean, I was in New Jersey. I was in Hoboken, right outside Manhattan, when all this was happening in 2012. I had just started as a professor, and I was talking about this stuff in class because I taught a class called Computers and Society. So this is what I was doing. I was constantly talking about current events. And in fact, like a huge portion of the class was just talking about current events with undergrads. And so I was talking about this stuff as it was happening. And I was like, this is because I'm like a pro-regulation guy. My first book is on automobile regulation. I'm into regulation. I'm like, this is not how you do this, right? You don't just go into places and do illegal shit, right? That's not how you do it. And like the undergrads were totally not with me. They're like, the taxi companies are bad. I mean, it's corrupt. It's a grift. And so like, I just wonder how much that kind of like set up the scenario so that people didn't react to Travis being an asshole the way they should have.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, that's part of it. But the other part of it, right, is that it's not as if the public transit system was something to celebrate anyway. I mean,
right.
We could tell the story as a
DC,
perfect storm.
right?
I don't think that's quite right, but certainly
it's
not as if the private, chauffeur services in the US were regulated in a good way. They hadn't protected they hadn't protected jobs in a good way, right? Compared to other places in the world. So I'm sure that was a contributing factor. And I think that's one of sort of the aims of our book is to help people see Uber as a symptom of all these existing problems and broken infrastructure.
Yeah, I think there's, it's interesting you say that. I mean, that came up in our interviews. It came up in everything we found in terms of what people sent to their council people, which is the taxis suck. What do you, the Uber actually comes.
Yeah.
And I think I think part of, it's like, it was a perfect storm, but how do we describe that storm? And I think it's like this just general disillusionment with legacy institutions, whether it's, defunct and sclerotic taxi system, whether it's the regulators who ostensibly are supposed to make sure the taxi system works, whether it's, officials at the city who are, who have let a mass transit system fall apart over the course of many decades. So it just this kind of just generalized disillusionment with the status quo, and then and Uber appears and it's shiny, like many new technologies.
And it did help you, right? And it did show up,
Yeah.
Yep. So by the time you guys when you started interviewing policymakers, it's 2016. Is that when you started? So where were people at then when you started? When you're thinking about regulating Uber and regulation and this? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Give it a shot.
Let's see. So we one one interview or two stand out. I think we did an interview with people like transportation officials at DC's DOT, and what was noticeable about the interview was that they were just like, yeah, we haven't thought about it. We haven't thought about Uber. Like we we're still trying to figure it out. And I think
wow.
Though early on it was this, and that happened in multiple instances where we're talking to people who are appointed or have positions of power in the city, and whether they're either don't know or don't have a kind of firm opinion on it, or kind of a wait and see approach, or they're generally positive. That would change over the course of the time we were doing interviews, and I think Uber's reputational stock just kind of was on a
Travis's reputational
right.
stock.
So the whole that was a bubble too. So I think that the whole kind of the public view of Uber would change, but early on it was this kind of it's a curious little thing. I don't know, which is telling in itself.
And with the change over time, we also saw change in policy, right? So even this year, DC added with its budget a new tax on a 25-cent tax or surcharge on ride hailing, which is going to raise $9 million to fund 12 overnight bus lines. That's the kind of thing that 10 years ago I could never imagine. That there wouldn't even be a political debate much to acknowledge and agree that yes, these services are causing congestion, they're idling, pollution, they're not paying their fair share, and we're not even sure that it's helping residents.
Yeah, and if they had tried it a decade ago, it would have gotten overturned right away. But I guess it stood, this tax. Yeah. One thing you mentioned that I didn't know about that I thought was fascinating was that I think DC had worked out with the big cab companies accessibility standards for like any fleet that had more than 30 cars or something had to have so much percentage of it was going to be accessible, and that got totally undermined. That's just like a really fascinating case of like how this kind of like just dodging regulation is just really led to bad stuff.
I mean, we think, the American Disabilities Act? What act? It doesn't even apply. What's the point? I mean, really, you take all these disability rights advocates and the work they've done for decades, and it just got thrown out the window, right?
And it's interesting because it kind of parallels, some of the. So Katie mentioned I had done work in public transportation. That was what my first.
Yeah. We can talk about buses all day, man. I get really excited about buses.
So part of it was, that taxis were they're latecomers in terms of responding to the mandates of the ADA, which is to make sure, there are public accommodations for people with disabilities. Like, with the passage in 1990, all buses have to have that. But the fight was, taxis it's a public transit-ish, and so those should apply. But it took so long for taxis to comply, and so just at the moment when taxis are, kind of making themselves accessible, you have this new entrant, which, as Katie says, is kind of taking out at the knees all the progress that, and activism. I mean, the fights for wheelchair lifts on taxis and on buses were the product of people with their wheelchairs going into the streets and stopping traffic. And all that is.
These are not
these are things that are products of struggle, advocacy, persistence, and so Uber, just kind of waddles into the scene and kind of just undermines all that. That was a very interesting finding. that was an early interview we did, I think, with a disability activist. It's just,
Yeah. One of the things I really like about the book is you so clearly put it in the context of DC and really think about what's happening in DC, which is a very specific place. And so we could have gone into like just how bad the DC Metro had gotten. There were all these fires. I mean, it was bad. Fires caused by bad maintenance, by the way, just to give a little shout out. I think we write about that in the Innovation Delusion. So there's connections there. But the second chapter, which is about kind of Uber positioning itself as this anti-racist force in the world. I mean, I had dark laughter while reading this chapter, I have to say. And there's this wonderful photo that was like some Uber ad campaign, like billboards.
If
I can't
you
remember exactly what it said.
tolerate racism, delete Uber.
Oh, that's
it was a way to do a play on the delete Uber campaigns that were in response to Trump's Muslim ban.
yeah, man.
Okay.
And so this was a way for the company to rebrand the delete Uber movement and make it anti-racist.
An anti-racist thing. Okay. So put these efforts in the context of DC, which obviously has, very famously has, a very rich racial history and all kinds of racial issues too. So, I mean, how did Uber's attempt to brand itself kind of play out in the DC area?
Okay, so so this is it's funny because I have so much to say about this particular chapter, and also the process of writing it and trying to figure out. Part of it is that and this was because Katie is a DC scholar, and has lived there for decades. There's so much that we didn't include in terms of the racial history of DC, but I think one of the things that we were trying to do in that chapter is to both look at the kind of cynical use of race and kind of Uber's own campaign, but to also think about the kind of racial tensions in the city in kind of two respects. The first respect is just the taxis. That is the experience of African Americans in DC and with the taxi system and not going to the places they want to go and not picking them up, and that being a very real thing. And
totally. But
then also, I think bigger picture, the kind of tensions around the transformations of DC demographically, the kind of the question of gentrification, urban evolution, the kind of there's a larger white population and a relatively shrinking black population in a city that had been given the name Chocolate City. So I think the part of this Uber actually allows us to tell that story, and that story also allows us to talk about why Uber found such resonated with purchase, perfect word, purchase with people, and I think that so we have Uber, I think in a deeply cynical way, pitching itself as a kind of answer to these kind of broader, what we would argue are structural problems, that are rooted in kind of the history of our nation's history. But all you need now is an app, and the problem is solved, and how that kind of solution on the cheap has, again, to use Katie's word, political purchase, because for people on legislators, council people, dealing with the structural issues of racism in DC, the kind of limits of that are the constraints on DC in terms of revenue and making sure that money to provide public services. You know, dealing with that and the racial consequences of that is a lot. As we say in the early chapters, like they are constrained. So Uber suddenly becomes a kind of a very attractive solution for, you know, political solution to these kind of stickier problems. I don't know, Katie. It's probably more about.
No,
Katie.
I mean, that was great.
No, that was great, man.
And I think the reality
really
is, right, this is contested land. There's a lot of strangers living here. It historically has been a place for the Black liberation movements, right? And so there is such irony and just such discomfort, right, with the reality that this corporation has been able to sell itself as anti-racist, right? We didn't want to discount the reality of all these people who are so happy to have, you know, a chauffeured car come to get them with a little blue dot, right? Yeah. But the reality is it's really messy on the ground, right? Because the taxi industry used to be a way for immigrants and especially African Americans to make a decent income and sustain their families. Whereas now, right, it's mostly West Africans. Or East Africans. I'm sorry. It's mostly, you know, Ethiopian, Eritrean folks who are doing it, right, who are less able to do it. And so there's also been this sort of, it's not really a black, like it's a messier picture when we look at the racism inherent against taxis, right? Not just the racism of taxis, but the racism against taxis. Totally. And so Uber just comes in, it's like, hey, I'll solve all your problems.
Yeah.
But I think it's impossible to look at Uber without thinking about it as playing up those, you know, like wedging itself in really comfortably to those divides.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right, and this is even pre Black Lives Matter, right? But you know, they saw it as politically efficacious to sell this message, I guess.
You were going to say something about the innovation delusion, maybe?
Oh, just when we were writing that book, it was like when we were kind of beating up on innovation speak and like the stupidity of the app economy, we were pumping in like, I would just do searches like apps to fight poverty. And you never really get some kind of listicle, like the top 10 apps for like beating poverty, right? And there's a top 10 list for like beating racism, and I can imagine, like, I don't think Uber was on there when I searched it, but you can imagine it being.
No, but I mean,
there,
that's one of the things. Airbnb made this campaign, right? When it was trying to fight regulation in one of its cities, it was showing, right, all of the women of color that benefit by being able to rent out a room. So any regulations on Airbnb is a regulation against independence and sovereignty of women of color, right? We saw this when Spike Lee, literally, like for real, Spike Lee did, you know, these videos for Uber of the Brooklyn Hustle. Okay. If you haven't seen them, Lee, you might want to look them up. They still exist.
Yeah.
Right. But it was about glorifying this idea of this is a way to make the hustle legit. And we even, we see it. I'm sorry. I was gonna say, we even see it this, you know, this season, in spring, Joe Biden celebrated, I think, DoorDash, because DoorDash is going to help solve, you know, American food deserts, right? I mean, we constantly see the same story, whether it's food deserts or racial inequality. There's an app for it.
There's an app for that.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that cues up the chapter on data pretty well, actually. So this is kind of a fascinating chapter on like the promise of data sharing around these apps and Uber. And first of all, I mean, you guys had a lot of interesting things to say about the labor that goes into creating the data. So, I mean, why don't we just start there? I mean, Uber Uber, what is Uber going to do with this data, or what is it giving to cities that's supposed to be so promising?
So, you know, okay, so data, they're going to give cities data, but I think it's so part of what we, you know, let me step back. So this chapter was actually, we had written a paper, like an academic paper, that, this chapter is a kind of, it's inspired by this other paper we had written. And and that, that paper took its starting point with the launch, I don't remember the year, 2018 maybe, of this thing called Uber Movement, which was basically this data sharing platform that Uber had launched, which would give cities all sorts of information about themselves, right? It would give them data about traffic patterns, where people are picking up and taking rides, where, even the conditions of the streets, because apparently your phone picks up, potholes and stuff like that. So, Uber basically claims through, that it has collected a tremendous amount of data about the city, about the people in the city, people who use it, people who drive for it, and that cities you could have it. You can have some of this data. And part of what we were kind of toying with, both in the article and then in the chapter, was to kind of complicate that story in two ways. One way was to say, like, look, there's this data doesn't emerge from the ether. It's the product of people working. It's the product of labor. It's the product of drivers. Drivers are producing this data, and it's important to remember that. It's important to think about the conditions that give rise to the data. And once you do that, you begin to think about questions of ownership, and if the data, how important the data is in terms of their evaluation as a company, for example. Like, then, well, to what degree do drivers or other people who are producing data have ownership over that valuation? And the second kind of tack in was to say, well, what is the data going to be used for anyway? How important is it? How important is it for cities to do? And it's interesting because I think we came to that latter point like later in the process. Like, we had presented this whole argument about labor and data and how, but we all did, right? I mean, this is the thing. I mean, your book, there's tons of stuff that's going to be is insightful into what we're experiencing right now, and will continue to be really important analysis for the years to come. But there's also parts, because it's a constantly evolving picture, that feel like they were a part of like that 2017, 2018, 2019 moment, right? And like the smart cities, the promise of data. This was the moment, right, where like we were going to datafy the shit out of cities, and it was going to be like magic. But it was like always like, what? What exactly?
Well,
is
and
it
we
gonna
fell
allow us to
for
do
that
again,
shit. I mean, that's a problem, right? That's what Kafui's gesturing toward, is that we sort of by the end are like, look, if we can just see the data, if we can just get access to the data, if we can just make Uber, I mean, it's like, but like we were in the midst of this and still doing it, saying if the city just gets access to Uber's data, and which I still kind of believe, but if we like, and finally we were giving a talk and someone's like, yeah, but like, what was the question, Kafui? It was like, why? To what end? Like, what are you going to do with more data?
And we were flummoxed. I remember getting the question, and I mean, I think my because I'm an academic, I was kind of like very defensive and being like, no, if I just have 20 minutes, I can explain it to you, to explain why it's so important. But then as I was thinking about it, I was like, oh no, she's absolutely right. Like we've kind of fallen for it. So that chapter is interesting because I think it tracks our evolution, over the course of the research, where, we're very concerned with, Uber has this data, we should get it, cities should have it. And then by the end of the chapter, we're like, oh, that we've fallen for it, that kind of, that sort of thing. And I think I honestly think the labor piece of it still holds as a way of thinking about it.
Oh,
but,
totally.
But yeah, it's
Well, and I still believe, I mean, I follow Meredith Whittaker and other folks who think that we should open up these companies' data actually to governments and maybe other folks too. So, I mean, I still think there's something to be said about opening up that data.
Absolutely.
It's just, I think that was a moment where it was like there was a lot of overpromising around data in general, right? I mean, maybe big data might have just been going out, but those kind of terms were around,
and
right?
I think that going back to the first tack or the first point of that chapter, right, of data about who makes the data, right, contributes to Meredith Whittaker's point and others that like we've made it, the public has made this data, right? And so the public as some collective governable entity has a right to, its benefits.
So the other thing, I mean, this is perfect, going from like smart cities and data and all this kind of stuff right into self-driving cars. I mean, this is another thing that look, there are self-driving cabs on some streets. I think in California, I can't remember where they're at. They're in the States. They're kind of functioning.
Lead, but did you see the new, there was some lovely Twitter thread today about people putting orange traffic cones on the vehicle's top to make them stop working.
Oh, really? I love it. Well, I mean,
that's all it takes to disable them, honey, is just an orange traffic cone. I mean,
yeah, I what do they call that? Oppositional hacking, or I can't remember the term, but I love
Ludditism.
This is the moment, though. There's so much promise around self-driving cars, and by now, Lyft and Uber have both sold off their autonomous
vehicle,
units, and I mean, it's just not really a real central part of the vision anymore. It doesn't seem like, but. Yeah, I mean, so what did you see coming at it from your lens of DC and how you're thinking about urban governance? What was the promise of self-driving vehicles all about as an ideology?
It was to dissuade the public from focusing on the present.
That's right.
I mean, it was a way to neuter, right, the really messy reality of right now as a way to be like, don't worry, just look down the jetway. Don't worry what's going on right here. Just keep your eyes forward. I mean, it did. That was what was so interesting about the AVs. And Declan, if he was here, would tell you how hooked he was on this from the beginning. Was this idea, it kept coming up in interviews with drivers where they would bring up this specter of automation. It was like, and it was almost a way to disable their own... to flip back to chapter 2, to disable the work they had done, to say, well, look, my job's going to disappear anyway because flying cars are going to arrive, right? So why work to improve this or better it or change it because it's going to disappear? And it was wild to hear policymakers echo a similar fatalism about what automation will do to place and power. So it was fascinating to watch an idea, sort of travel across time and still build absolutely nearly nothing. Right.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think that chapter, Declan had written on a piece for Dissent magazine, before, which kind of articulated, again, like we move from that piece to this chapter. And, I think I think there was a sense that honestly, we weren't quite sure about where the AVs were going to go. I mean, we're not engineers. It's hard to assess any of this stuff. What we can say is what function they serve now. And going back to Katie's point, that is like as a disincentive for workers seeing any future in the job. So tons of interviews being like, hey, look, I don't, this job isn't great. It serves my needs now, but honestly, it's not going to be here forever. But then I think there was two other pieces, which one which was just, that this is like the innovation delusion, the kind of the degree to which innovation is central to a kind of speculative economy, that it provides an asset class in which to invest, and people have tons of money. They don't know where to put it, and there's some places that the places to get a higher return, you need a more risky investment outlet, and so it means seeing these kind of AVs as disciplining labor, providing a surplus outlet for surplus capital, and again promising solutions to problems in the present that politically seem too tough to tackle. So I was just in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we were walking downtown, and it reminded me of the chapter, and we saw one of these security robots. It looks like
a cooler, right?
Yeah, it looks like a futuristic fridge on wheels, and it's like it's so unclear what security purpose it can serve. You can see where the camera is. You could just put a piece of paper over the camera and it would be disabled. You could outrun it. You could topple it over. But it's not it's like the spectacle of innovation has this other kind of role. It's just like,
Well, I just pulled up Uber's stock price, I mean, like, and the moment, this 16, 17, 18 moment, it was pretty hot.
It's going to save the world, Lee.
Yeah. I know.
Get them.
Well, and this self-driving car thing, man, talk about academics falling for stuff. I mean, I knew so many people in my field who were like doing all this, like, how are we going to manage the ethical, legal, and social implications of self-driving cars, and like they were they're like doing like futures or imaginaries or some crap around self-driving cars where they're like, oh, we won't need parking garages anymore. And they're like, no, we'll turn that all into parks. And they're just doing all these kind of, it was like, they really fell
especially
for it,
in a moment of climate change when the earth is on fire, it is wild to me that we are still pursuing the idea of individual metal boxes going around spouting fossil fuels.
I know.
Like, what?
I know. And even EVs, I have a good episode with Bob Charette on
that was
EVs
a great one,
and their limits. Well, thank you. So I really like your focus on cities and governance. There's so much there has been so much written, some of it really good, some of it not so good, maybe stuff on workers and Uber and Lyft and the sharing economy. So what did you guys want to do with the final chapter on workers and the workforce? I mean, what did you really want it to be like your thing there in this kind of mix?
Kafui, what did we want our thing to be?
Sometimes you don't know.
Okay, I'll give it a go. I mean, I think, so this project started with a focus on workers. That was our original, our original focus. Through those interviews, we realized, we should be thinking, we should be thinking about the urban environment in which workers live to make sense of why they're in this industry or why this industry has taken off or why it's been successful. So it started with workers, we scaled up to the city. But I think like in terms of thinking about change and transformation and, how we move forward, I think going back to workers actually makes the most sense. They're not only, they are not only workers, they're citizens. And understanding, their motivations and how they think politically or don't think politically about their work, or the contradictions between how they see their work and how they live in the city. Engaging workers seems to be a way to,
a way forward.
Yeah.
Right. And the right place, right?
Yeah.
We're not sort of knocking on factories' doors, right, for change. This is a different kind of political movement, especially coming out of, think of Occupy Wall Street, but also Tahrir Square. Like there was a different kind of gathering point in which the public is becoming visible. And the 2019 strikes felt to us like something we needed to document. And I will say that even last month, there were strikes again in DC at the airport in the same place, right? And I think that's not coincidental. It's a place in which drivers gather, they get to know each other, they build relationships. And so if there was a contribution that our work has to all the existing wonderful work on the gig economy and its workers, it was to inject place and to think about the place, the workplace where people gather and how they exercise power in those places or don't, right? I mean, one of the things we've learned this week is that just like in 2019, the drivers that recently organized a DCA last month, many of them have been deactivated again, like clockwork.
Wow. How do they see
How does
that?
who see what?
The Uber deactivates.
Yeah,
them
Uber
as
finds
drivers?
there's issues with their paperwork, their, some kind of thing,
I
right?
see.
There's
Yeah.
there's also increased police presence at the airport. There's some kind of strong relationship between the airport police authorities and these companies.
I see. All right.
No,
That's
it
pretty
is,
dark.
right? But again, if there's going to be a response, right, it can't just be the customer base organizing. We also hope for it to be workers and for workers to see themselves as not just toiling in this shitty workplace, but also sort of being set up to fail a bit, that it's not their own shortcomings if they hit barriers.
When I was reading this, I've always found puzzling. I went to try to find these surveys, and they're like by newspapers, so God knows what the quality is. But I've often been puzzled by how many drivers were reporting like being fairly satisfied with their work. And this has apparently gone down in the last couple of years from what I was seeing when I was looking at this the last few days. But at one point, they were like fairly satisfied. So I just wondered if that came out in your interviews too.
Yeah. I mean, some of the work. Oh, Kafui, do you want to take this? No, I mean, that was something we struggled with at each interim. Every time we would cycle back to workers, right? We'd want to know both. And we would ask these questions multiple times, as good qualitative researchers do who seek out triangulation, right?
Yep.
So would you recommend this job to a friend? What would you say to a friend who is going to do this? What do you wish you would have known before you started it? Will you be doing this job in 6 months? And one thing that kept coming up was that even if people were really, really frustrated with the job and angry and felt they had been cheated, they still often saw themselves as sticking with it for a while. Now, that didn't always hold the case, when we'd circle back and ask them. But in many ways, right, that was more a reflection of their other labor market opportunities, I think. And they're, they have to take their dad to dialysis. They have to pick up their kid, for a doctor's appointment. They have all kinds of responsibilities for which they have no social safety net, either, sort of other humans to help care for them or, financial resources. And so, sure, this is if the city's response is just let Uber do it, then I think a lot of the workers' response was, well, who else is going to help us accept Uber, right? What other way can we pick up money and
it's flexible too. I mean, that's
well,
one
there's a
benefit that's
prospect
real,
of
right?
flexibility. It doesn't mean there actually is, Lee, because it means you can log on. It doesn't mean you're guaranteed any jobs, right? But there is a possibility, and that possibility is a step up from the W-2 jobs that so many of the workers have toiled in, right? In which they already were algorithmically managed, right? You work for the Gap or Applebee's. It doesn't mean you're going to have like a set schedule. And it doesn't even mean what time you get off on Saturday. So this is a step up, right? From an otherwise shitty work, environment.
Yeah.
Totally.
Well, I was going to say
Definitely,
that
go
I
ahead.
think this was just reflecting on, our own kind of the assumptions we brought to the work. I think we. Katie, stop me if I'm going off the rails. But I was going to say that a lot. We came to the work with some priors, which were these aren't great jobs, and we'd expect that people in them would say that, and we got some of that. But we also got the kind of like, but it's flexible. I'm at a particular moment in my life, and actually this works perfectly fine for me. And I think even with those priors, we saw tensions and contradictions within drivers themselves. So you'd have a driver that was a shop steward in their union at their regular. So they have a public sector job, right?
Right.
It pays okay, but not great. They need extra money, and they're involved with their union, and they're working for Uber. And you ask them, like, what do you think about Uber? Oh, it's great. Do you think Uber drivers should be unionized? No. And then there's another example of someone who loves Uber, and during the whole metro apocalypse in whatever year it was, when all the trains were broken and not working, you'd have catching on fire in flames. We had a driver who was like, "This is great for me. This is great for business because people need rides." But 5 minutes later in the same interview, she's talking about, "Oh, I would love to work for Metro because that's a middle class job," and from one perspective, you see those as like contradictory views. But I think if you dig deeper, it's just symptomatic. It's just symptomatic of what we said in the beginning, which is people don't have faith in Uber as like for social mobility, but they have even less faith in the institutions that exist elsewhere. And so I think that's what we were trying to get at across the different chapters, which is like, Uber isn't great, but it's symptomatic. It's symptomatic of a set of lowered expectations, writ large across various sectors of urban life.
And I should say, certainly some of the workers in our study left the gig economy never to return. I mean, absolutely. There was a big, especially after they get their taxes a year in. I mean, there's definitely a jump, but there's other people who return or stick with it in various iterations. And
totally. Yeah. So what part really, in wrapping up, kind of like we're headed towards the end, I wanted to give you all a chance to revise the conclusion again, or like, so in the conclusion, you talk about COVID, but I want to do that, talk about COVID a bit, but then we can bring it up even more to the present. Your book just came out, it was 2023. So when did it come out? Spring?
August 15.
That's not out.
Oh, it's not even out yet. Shit. Oh man. Well, this is how books work. At some point you have to stop writing. I wanted to plug you guys about things that have been happening like in recent months. So let's do the COVID thing first. So tell us add COVID to the story.
We switched to online interviews. It was so much easier to schedule. People were so excited to meet us. We did not have to go to Panera's or the library or Starbucks. It was like so freaking quick. Oh my God. And I think people were also excited to talk to us. I don't want to say excited. They were willing. It was quick. It was fast. There was a loneliness, right? We were doing this in June of 2020 and May of 2020. I mean, this was we had planned to do interviews in person that summer.
This is the Tiger King period of the COVID.
It was like...
Yeah.
Wow, bring it back, Kafui.
Well, yeah, that was a blast.
So, people were... The interviews itself got raw. There was more sort of intimate detail, right? We were talking to people in a vulnerable moment. We ourselves were tired. My kids were home. It was messy, right? So there was an intimacy, I think, that was a gift to the project that came out of that period that I would not have expected. And I wonder what our attrition rate would have been had we continued in person for those follow-up interviews in subsequent years. There's a lot more texting. I was also busy helping folks try to apply for PUA or trying to get folks information about how do you apply for pandemic unemployment assistance, right? It was the first time the federal government offered money to gig workers, $600 a week. I mean, that was huge, right? So I was texting them if I saw something. The relationship changed a bit. But how did COVID shape their work?
Yeah.
I mean, that sort of gave birth to my next project, which is around delivery. So many of them left ride hailing work for DoorDash, Instacart, Uber Eats, Drizzly, GoPuff. I mean, this was their moment to shine.
Yep, sure was. Kafui, what you want to add anything there?
No, I think that it was easier. I am in Poughkeepsie, so New York, not DC. So having interviews with drivers from here was a lot easier.
A lot easier in your life, huh?
Yeah. So
yeah.
I think it is an interesting time to look back to. I don't think we talk too much about it in the book, but the question of what is an essential service, an essential worker, that rhetoric had kind of was emerging, and it was unclear where kind of Uber and delivery drivers fell within that. There's just a lot of confusion about how to
and anger also. I should have said that, right? Some of the workers were angry if they went to deliver food or water for somebody who looked able-bodied. Right. Others were angry that they had to take exposure. So they would put up, what's the plastic called? Not saran wrap. What's it called? Not vinyl. The sheathing, the clear sheathing. What do you call that?
Plexiglass.
Yes.
No. Yeah.
Something, with duct tape to try to keep themselves away from the, aerosols. So there were some real deep feelings about the injustices of how delivery was, and ride hail were distributed. And that was something that I don't remember hearing 3-4 years earlier, where some people said, look, I'd be happy to do this work and take these risks if I knew it was for someone who is elderly or sick, right? I'd be happy to pick them up and help them get to chemo. I'm not happy to go take somebody, to a friend's house when they're flouting whatever rule that is supposed to be in place about bubbles.
One of the things I wanted to ask you all about wrapping up is I think it's become obvious over time just how highly unprofitable these companies are. So, that's amazing, right? In the earlier period when you were really starting this research, there was still a lot of promise and hype around these things, and it was like, they're gonna set up a monopoly, and it's gonna be like they're gonna be so powerful and all this kind of stuff, right? And it's like, it's not clear they're ever gonna make a profit. There's still I think 2022 they were $10 billion.
But they made a monopoly
last year. They did. Did they?
I mean, don't these companies together form one? I mean, is that not a definition of a monopoly? I see them as these massive corporate. I see a monopoly as something with massive outsized power. What else could?
Yeah, right.
I think.
Well, I mean.
Well, I was gonna.
Yeah, go ahead, Kafui. I'm just thinking about the profits
I
part.
think it's a great. We live in strange times. This is not your grandfather's capitalism.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think Declan had a great line for this period, juicero capitalism, which was a reference to the kind of juicing machine, and I think it's interesting because in some ways it's like how people talk about zombie neoliberalism. This kind of undead idea that despite all the obvious flaws just continues. There's a kind of zombie character to a lot of these companies that just kind of continue to move along irrespective of quote unquote market forces. They're not being disciplined in ways. And I think part of understanding it is that they are still places where people invest in it, and they are held up by faith. There's almost a religious quality to kind of what what sustains
Yeah.
them. But I think there's something. I think stopping there is probably the wrong place to stop, because I think they do have like an effect on the kind of fundamental material reality for workers, which is they
Yeah.
whether they are profitable or unprofitable, whether the fundamentals are there, which it's clear they're not, or not, their purpose and function in the economy is to provide this kind of ever expanding reserve army of labor that presses down the wages and working conditions of people in what remains of traditional employment. And I think there's I don't know. I mean, it's unclear how long they can continue this, but it's
Yeah. Well, they've torn up a lot of shit in the
right.
meantime.
Yeah.
Even if Lyft like disappears, right? They have like done a lot of bad stuff, and they've undermined public transit. I mean, they've done like, and they were burning venture capital the whole time. That's why it was affordable for them just to take these rides. But in the meantime,
and I
they
think
did a lot
there's
of
like
damage,
this story.
you know?
I think there's this like broader story, because it's not like this is a new story. So just because my other work is on transit, there's like the history of early transit is like a history of speculation, especially in like the Western cities, where they're just like running track at huge expense to run transit at like 5 cents, and they're not making any money, but the money is in real estate that the owners also own and they can sell off. But that sort of speculation, I think, is fundamentally different. The tracks are still there when they get bankrupt. They can be bought by the city or taken over. It's like Uber could disappear, and what will we be left with? We'll be left with like disinvested transit system, broken people, broken cities, less faith in our urban politics, and no real infrastructure. I mean, it's different than like real estate speculation in some ways.
Logistics software. Well, I mean, we'll have that forever. That's it, though, right? Yeah. It's like, well, we'll always order our calls or our rides from an app.
But I think
now,
it's a great question.
Whatever.
I think the way to think about it is, all right, what will happen when it disappears? What is it doing? What happens when it disappears, and what is it doing to our society now?
And then, the third is what would have had to have happened for it not to arrive on our phones.
Yeah, what conditions of urban life, gave rise to it, and what
because it doesn't exist everywhere, right?
Right.
Yeah. Man, I have so many more questions I want to ask you about. Instead, I'm going to ask you just to say what's next. So, Katie, you're doing something on delivery? That's your next
right.
project?
Yep.
Okay. Cool. And are you where are you at with that?
So I had a first report come out earlier this year around the working conditions of 40 delivery workers in the DC area, as well as the lobbying activities of the 6 main delivery companies. They've spent $1.87 million in the DC area in the last few years.
Right. Where folks find that?
I guess online.
Yeah.
They look me up and you type in Georgetown delivery study. How's that?
Okay,
or
that
they
works.
can go to your you have a website.
Or they
I
can
have a website. It's katiejwells.net.
Okay. All right. Perfect. And Kafui, what about you, man? Are you doing more buses?
I don't know what I'm doing. I have.
Yeah. It's all right, man.
No,
Lots
he's
of
got
people
it
say
great.
that
Wait.
And I would say that myself.
Give a shout out here.
Go ahead.
So,
well, I was gonna say your archival work.
Oh yeah, I'm doing some projects.
I think Lee would be into that.
Yeah, I'm getting
excited
some projects on the newspaper industry, the archives associated with newspaper industry, the future of kind of local press. It's very different than what I've been doing. So I'm doing a lot of reading about it at this stage. So something along those lines. I have other Yeah, I've been doing a lot of local history and, tours. I do a lot of, in Poughkeepsie, there's a abolitionist kind of history here. And so we can do walking tours, helping to do that.
That's cool, dude.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. I'm a historian by training, so I love all that stuff. And I love local history. I'm into it here where I live. So very cool. Props to you for that. Yeah. Well, both of you, thanks you so much for coming on and taking the time to talk to
Lee,
me.
Thank
this
you.
was so fun.
This was great. It's really, really fun.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Ford is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.